Can you please welcome Dr. John Froude?
I'm going to be talking mainly about viruses, and this is true. You're living in the golden age of virology. We have learned more about viruses in the last 10 years than all previous time. And, I'm here, viruses at the literary festival. Well, I'm going to ask you, if you can tell me the difference at the end of my presentation, where literature ends and viruses begin, I will very much appreciate it. Secondly, we are living at a golden era, not just virology, also DNA technology and scientific advance on a fantastic scale. And I think everybody should know a little bit about this. The well-dressed primate, people such as ourselves, should know a little bit about this. And the third reason is that you're by now, all of you, veterans of a plague. You know that it's more than a clinical description in a textbook of medicine, and that it affects society as a whole in all kinds of different ways. It affects economy and policy and the way you feel every day when you get up, and it affects your interpersonal relationships as well. It's getting to sound a little bit like a novel. So these are the reasons why we're talking about viruses at Ropetackle. The word means poisonous secretions in Latin. It used to be used with that sense in English, rarely, before about 1880, when some very brilliant botanists showed that disease in tobacco plants was caused by something smaller than a bacteria. How did they know this? Because they had a filter that filtered bacteria out. This was prescient work, 1880. Nobody paid any attention to them at all. By 1918, when Spanish flu was around, people still didn't really accept there were things called viruses. Spanish flu was attributed universally to a bacteria called Haemophilus influenzae. And it's still around to this day, that bacteria, but it didn't cause Spanish flu. There were a handful of crackpots and eccentrics and ne'er-do-wells who suggested that it might be due to a virus, but they were universally ignored, completely ignored. So why is this the golden age of virology? Viruses are smaller than the wavelength of light. This was the first microscope. Van Leeuwenhoek, Antonin van Leeuwenhoek, in 1676. Now, it's amazing, isn't it? He puts a little drop of water here and looks through a lens and could see little squiggly creatures moving about. And he did diagrams of these and sent them off to the Royal Society in London, the premier scientific organization of the time. And they wrote back and said, "Dear Mr. Leeuwenhoek, we admire your pictures, but we feel you've been drinking too much Geneva." They didn't really believe him. Of course, you couldn't have seen a virus through that because it's smaller than the wavelength of light. So the electron microscope, that's what they look like today. They have computers which can interrogate huge volumes of data. You can actually look and see the viruses under the electron microscope. And the other thing is that DNA technology has expanded in leaps and bounds. To give you a rough idea, if you're prepared to go as far back in time as 2003, the human genome was sequenced. Every little base pair, 3 billion base pairs of its DNA was sequenced. It cost $3 billion and took 4 years. Now, in 2020, you can get your DNA sequenced for $99.99 in 3 days. Astounding. That's a measure of the astounding advances that have been made in DNA technology. To prove, these are my bona fides as a local. That's where I went to school. That's Stenning Grammar School on Sports Day. No, wait a minute. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's called The Victory of Death by Peter Bruegel the Elder. Now, when you hear that Peter Bruegel is the elder, you think he's an old bloke. Actually, no, he died at 37 from some infectious disease, possibly plague. And this picture is profoundly influenced by the bubonic plague or the Black Death, the one plague everybody feels they know something about. His death in the middle, with his scythe on a pale horse, he seems to be pushing everybody into containers. You know, I didn't know they had containers back then, but all around here, everybody's dying. 3 little points of interest. People are being executed here, and this is consistent with the idea that plagues were punishment from God for sin or sins, known or unknown. The other thing is, here's Shoreham over here, see? Ships sinking, on fire. But ports are very important in the spread of plagues. They are crossroads. It is ports that have suffered the most. Consider London, consider Marseille, consider Venice. You can put into your computer any port in Europe and the Black Death, and something will bubble up. Dublin had a bad time. Oslo was particularly scourged by the Black Death. So, and the third point to make about this, it was called the triumph of death. Yes, that's right, the triumph of death. But in fact, death has not triumphed. And there are good biological reasons for that. In our lifetime alone, the population on Earth has increased from 3.2 billion to 7.4 billion. So death is not triumphing. And in spite of all these plagues in which tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people died, the population of the species continues to grow. I'm just going to do a very brief review of plagues in literature. Homo sapiens appeared on Earth about 300,000 years ago. There was before him was Neanderthalis and Homo erectus, and we were descended from primates, common primates. We still share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So we didn't do which may surprise some more than others, but we didn't do much, really, until 70,000 years ago, when we walked out of Africa to populate the world. One thing you can be sure of was that we told a lot of stories. We're addicted to and continually tell endlessly stories. But there were no written stories until 2000, before the Common Era, 2200. And this was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the minute people started writing things down, they started writing about plagues. Okay, here's the king, King Gilgamesh. His right-hand man, the Enkidu, they are joined at the hip. They fight in battles together. And they insult the gods, so naturally the gods kill him, don't they? They kill Enkidu. He dies over 3 days. His mind becomes confused. He's sweating. He's obviously dying from an infectious disease. This devastates Gilgamesh, and the rest of the book are stories about him looking for the secret of immortality, which of course he never finds, and he dies at the end of the saga. So it's a very existential truth to this story. Right, next, it took another 1,000 years before the final version of the Torah, 500 years before the Common Era. And the Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also known as the Pentateuch. And as you will all remember from your reading of the Old Testament, it's packed with plagues, endless plagues, either on the Egyptians or on the Israelites. It's easy to see why, looking back. There were 1 million Israelites in tents in the middle of the desert with domesticated and undomesticated animals. Perfect setup for getting plagues, of course, but that was not how it was interpreted. Plagues were punishment from God, full stop. That's it. What did you do? We'll think of something, but you're being punished. Homer opens the Iliad with a plague. Somebody offends Apollo. Apollo's really pissed. He goes and kills all the Achaeans, fires arrows and kills them all, and he kills their dogs and their mules as well. Come to the Middle Ages. Dante wrote about hell, but he missed the Black Death. He was dead before the Black Death came along. Petrarch took Dante's description of hell as a description of what it was like living in Italy during the Black Death. And he writes very movingly of coming into villages where everybody is dead. But the most sympathetic and kind of accessible of these writers is Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron, influenced Shakespeare, amongst others. And it's a long series of stories by a group of people that they tell to each other on the run from the plague in Florence. The Black Death in Florence. It's really a great read. The trouble is it needs a new translation because the old flowery English that was used in earlier translations is very irritating and tedious. But apart from that, he's your man, Boccaccio. Come to England, you got another guy who likes telling stories, Chaucer. You remember the Pardoner's Tale, in which three men go looking for death and they find it. Now, I can't pass William Shakespeare by. I'm sorry, I'm not sorry to say, but Willie the Shake certainly had a lot to do with, he was interested in infectious diseases tremendously. He lived in the great metropolis of London that had nearly 200,000 people living there, the biggest city in the country. They were poor people from the countryside, crowded together. They brought their animals with them. Poverty, the association between poverty and prostitution is well known. So there was a brisk sex industry, and they had to suffer ague or malaria. They had to suffer smallpox. They had to suffer tuberculosis. They had to suffer typhus. And they also suffered the bubonic plague. And they also suffered syphilis. Many commentators believe that Shakespeare had syphilis. One reason for this might be that there are 350 references to syphilis in his work, and only 5 to plague. I mean, a plague on both your houses, and it's a plot device in Romeo and Juliet, but really, he's not interested in the plague. He's interested in the French disease, as it was called, or the gore, or the infinite malady. And baldness is the key, you see? Baldness. You could be bald for 100 reasons. Any bald people in the audience? Because in those days, you were vulnerable to the suggestion that you might have syphilis if you were bald, which accounts for the popularity of wigs, which I'll come on to in a minute. Smallpox made you bald as well. Smallpox made Queen Elizabeth I bald, took out her eyebrows as well, and she was always wearing a wig. It may have something to do with why she was a virgin queen. I don't know. But he was hypersensitive. Willie the Shake was hypersensitive to the suggestion that he might have syphilis, and he probably did. He had this terrible tremor, and this is a consequence of mercury salts, which are used to treat syphilis. And he never wrote in the last 3 years of his life, which people have always been interested in. So it's quite possible that the bard had syphilis. He writes, "Hair is a blessing." See, so don't talk to me about my baldness. This is Daniel Defoe, no problems here, right? So this shows you what wigs are all about. You know, when you look at Daniel Defoe, you know that he certainly doesn't have the infinite malady. He wrote Journal of a Plague Year. Now, in the 19th century, practically any great writer that you write about has to invoke infectious diseases. This is Anton Chekhov, the father of all doctor writers. He himself died of tuberculosis at a young age. But you could have put Dostoevsky up there or Tolstoy, anybody you like. Name somebody at random, Marcel Proust, anybody. And they all have to talk about plagues. Which brings us to Charles Dickens. If I could go back in time and ask him one question, it would be, what have you done to your hair? I mean, it looks ridiculous. I mean, what, you're an old man. Why have you got your hair like that? That's what I'll probably ask him. Anyway, in Bleak House, Esther Summerson gets smallpox, which makes her ugly, and her guardian proposes marriage to her because he doesn't think anybody else is going to do it. But somebody does, and she finds true love in spite of her pockmarks. Now, I love this picture. This is Louis Pasteur. None of those great faces that I just showed you, those great men, those great stories, had the faintest idea why it was that their loved ones, their relatives, their children themselves were dropping dead. No idea, none whatsoever. I must have committed a sin. I don't know. Until Louis Pasteur came along and showed that some febrile illnesses were due to bacteria. And I love this picture because it looks as if he's come out of a dinner party, a boring dinner party. He can't wait to get back and look at his cultures. But this was the beginning of light. It was Louis Pasteur, 1850, let's say. Okay, so on average, there are 3 global pandemics per century. What were the 3 global pandemics in the 20th century? This is a quiz.
Spanish flu.
Spanish flu
AIDS.
is correct. AIDS is correct. What was the third one?
SARS.
No, can't give you stars. Polio is a good try. It's a good try. I'm going to have to hurry you.
Ebola.
No, Ebola's quite good, but not many people died. There were lots and lots and lots of infections. Well, malaria's been around for a very, very long time, and you couldn't put it in the 20th century. This is really going to surprise you. Smallpox. Smallpox in the 20th century killed more people than died from AIDS and Spanish flu put together, which is counterintuitive because smallpox was eradicated from the world in 1975 by vaccination. And yet in those 75 years, 300 million people died. The last cases of smallpox to be recorded in England were in which town? Brighton. Who said Brighton? You are correct, sir. The last cases of smallpox, 1950, New Year's Eve, an RAF soldier came back from Pakistan, and 30 people were infected, 10 of whom died. That was the mortality of smallpox, 30%. 30%. And even if you didn't die from it, you could become blind. You could have neurological disorder as well. You would have psychiatric disorder because you'd be pockmarked for the rest of your life. So look at that. Now, the saying goes, if one person dies, it's a tragedy. If many people die, it's a statistic. This is poor Joe, the crossing sweeper in Bleak House. Poor Joe, the crossing sweeper, he dies from smallpox. And Dickens says, "He's dead, your majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts and dying thus around us every day." So we say 50 million deaths is a statistic. You can understand that, but in reality it's 50 million tragedies. So this is some Ripley's Believe It or Not about viruses. Viruses, thousandth width of human hair, stretch 200 million light years into space. That's practically impossible to believe. I've checked the number several times. Smaller than the wavelength of light, 200 million light years into space. That's how many viruses there are. 25 million blue whales. That's just the viruses in the ocean. So when you go swimming on Shoreham Beach and you swallow a teaspoonful of water, you've swallowed 5 million viruses. You didn't know that, did you? Happily, they don't cause disease in humans, these sea viruses, and they go straight through you. Cut to the chase. There is 2,000 species of viruses so far discovered, which only represents 0.1%. That should be 0.1% of the estimated number of virus species. So they're everywhere. They're in a cloud. We walk around in a cloud of viruses. What is 10 to the 33? I have no idea. This is a number beyond my comprehension. Could you explain it to me, 10 to the 33? All I know is that of stars in the universe is 10 to the 25. So it's that many more. All living things are infected with viruses, including viruses. They're made up of RNA or DNA in a protein coat. Of the 8 classes of virus, 3 are RNA and 5 are DNA. All other animal and plant life uses DNA. So there are just 3 classes of virus which replicate with RNA. And this suggests that they are fossils of the first living chemical, RNA. that 3 billion years ago, the first replicating molecule was RNA. And these RNA viruses today are fossils of that period of time, 3.5 billion years ago. Don't look at the bit in the middle. Look at this bit. One virus comes in, all these viruses come out. As many as 100,000 viruses can come out of one cell. And then the cell gets depleted and dies. So you can see these 100,000 go off and infect other cells, that the cells die off, and that you're going to die off as well. That's how it causes death. And when there is more life, there are more viruses. So this is excruciatingly important. In the rainforests, there are countless viruses because there's more life. The rainforest occupies about 5% of the surface of the globe around the equator, and there are 50% of known life forms live in the rainforest. The only thing that comes close is the ocean, which is a seething mass of life interacting and living and dying and replicating at a phenomenal rate, from the most microscopic all the way up to whales. And I would point out that the DNA in these viruses is exactly the same as your DNA, the DNA that you have in your cells and all living creatures. This is a mimivirus. These were only discovered in 1999. They led to the redefinition of viruses because they were so big. You could see them under a light microscope. How could they be a virus? They need to replicate in another cell, usually an amoeba. These little things are viruses inside the virus. So this virus is infected by viruses. That's HIV budding out of a cell. It's beautiful, isn't it? Five little girls from school. Here they're trying to get into a lymphocyte. This is HIV. Look at this amazing thing. It looks like a lunar module. This is a bacteriophage, or a virus that infects a bacteria. And look, it lands on the bacteria and squeezes its RNA into the cell where it replicates, or its DNA. They come in all shapes and sizes. This is the Ebola. This is not an artifact. That's what it looks like, that 8 and the O on the end there. That's a bunch of bacteriophage trying to get into a bacteria on a busy Friday night. This is a picture of the sun. Flames arise out of the sun in a crown, in a corona. That's the coronavirus. So viruses cause diseases. That's an absolute fact. There's no question of doubt about it. Is there? But they can't cause disease by themselves. They need some help. This represents cancer. Viruses cause cancer. The commonest cancer in the world is cancer of the liver, which is associated with hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Not in the United Kingdom, in the world in general. That's an alveolus. That's what your lungs look like. The beautiful lacy tissue. Oxygen can easily flow in and out of the blood vessels running through the lacy tissue. That's what it looks like if you have pneumonia, influenza pneumonia, or coronavirus pneumonia. It's easy to see that oxygen can't get in. Okay, that's a normal chest X-ray, and that's one with a pneumonia. This person is in serious difficulty. Yes, and that's how we feel. This is the painter of the Scream. His name is Edvard Munch, and this picture is called Artist with Flu. And when you look at him, you can see that he's got the flu, can't you? When you look at his face, you can see he's got the flu. It's a great picture, anyway. So, but that's not enough, is it? Viruses can't walk, they can't talk, they can't... How do they get around? What's going on here? The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, absolutely necessary. This is Albrecht Dürer, 16th century. Now, here's death. Interesting, isn't he? Because he's a sort of middle-aged man with a pair of scales. He doesn't have a scythe. This is much more scary. He's going to measure your worth and, either kill you or not. That's death for you. Here is war. Here is famine. You can use a skinny guy on a skinny horse. And this is pestilence, firing his arrows of disease. Look down here. There's this sort of mitred cleric having his head bitten off by a horrid beast, and ordinary people are being trampled underfoot. But the only sign of hope is this angel flying high above them all. Who does the angel represent, I wonder? I think it's the NHS. And these are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and it's well known that war tends to plagues. There are many examples of this. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, he was defeated as much by typhus as he was by the Russians or the bad winter. The doughboys who came and fought in the First World War, about 200,000 of them died. Over half of those died from Spanish flu. The other half died from bullets. So over and over again through history, the four horsemen, the three horsemen work together in honor of the fourth horseman, death. But there are many ponies of the apocalypse as well. Now, I was told that the one thing you must never do in any presentation is put a long list and then slowly go down the whole list from top to bottom. Okay. Travel. 3 billion flights yearly. SARS, coronavirus, okay, the virus is called Severe Adult Respiratory Syndrome, Coronavirus 2. That's the name of the virus. It belongs to the family coronavirus, and the disease it causes is COVID-19. But for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to talk about the coronavirus, because it's easier that way. This is unique. This pandemic that we are living through is unique in a number of ways. Number one, it spread around the world in 4 months. Smallpox, it took 100 years. The Spanish flu took a year. This has done it in 4 months. This is not a feature of the virus. This is a feature of the airplane. And what we're going to have to be able to do in the future is detect asymptomatic carriers getting on planes. Every single country in the world has the coronavirus. Somebody in Wuhan, China, breathed on somebody who breathed on somebody else, who breathed on somebody else, who breathed on somebody in Spain, who came to Shoreham and breathed on Janet and Neville Presley and gave them the coronavirus. Isn't that extraordinary? It's incredible. But that's how it happens. It's very contagious, but it's the aeroplane that has made it go around the world this quickly. While I'm on the subject, the other things that make it unique is that the organism that caused the plague was discovered in January 2020. That is 3 months after it started in China. That's never been the case before. Nope, the cause of Spanish flu was found 10 years later. There is no other microbe in history that has been discovered so quickly to be the cause of a pandemic. All right. It's already very important to talk about proximity to animals. We are animals. We are animals. And the viruses, the word is spillover from one species to another. As a point of interest, I will tell you that measles virus, canine distemper virus, and rinderpest, disease of cattle, are practically identical. You can't distinguish them by light microscopy. Only by detailed DNA studies can you distinguish between these 3 viruses. And the principle is that they all evolved when we started domesticating animals and dogs in about 10,000 before the Common Era. Rinderpest has the honor of having been wiped out. It's the only other pandemic other than smallpox that's been eradicated from the face of the earth, and it's in animals. It's a pity that measles hasn't been eradicated. It could be, in principle, but it hasn't been. Rainforest. Bats are reservoirs of viruses. They contain many viruses, and they don't get disease. Occasionally, they spit them out. Now, you can get an infection from a bat, but usually via an intermediate host, such as Fred. Fred the primate, for instance. Now, man goes into the rainforest, pandemics come out. This is bushmeat. People kill animals and eat them, surprise, surprise. But it's more than that. Bushmeat is a big industry in Africa now, today, a $1.5 billion industry, and they even export it to places like illegally to places like London and New York and Toronto, but it's almost anything. They eat monkeys, they eat anything that's in the rainforest. And the other people going into the rainforest are Western forces looking for precious elements or just for timber or to graze cattle for burger meat. AIDS came out of the rainforest. Hepatitis C out of the rainforest. Dengue, Ebola out of the rainforest. West Nile, chikungunya, Zika, yellow fever. All of these came from the rainforest. And these are the other ponies of the apocalypse. Many. Stupidity, ignorance, poor mosquito control, delusional ideas, political incompetence, sexual tourism, climate change, disagreeing experts. Sound familiar? Now, we're meticulous here. If anything political comes up, we obscure the name so that you can't read it and see it. See, we've obscured the name up here, so you've no idea who we're talking about. It's funny that this cartoon was way back in May. COVID cases have gone up here, haven't they? Since May, and the deaths also. Misinformation continues at about the same level, and buck passing. But actually, there hasn't been a lot of scapegoating. There's been some. Trump has talked about the Kung Flu virus, for instance, and the Chinese virus, and other ridiculous statements. And some Chinese Americans have been beaten up in a few cities as being responsible. And some lunatic congressman wants to sue China to repay all the money that they've lost as a consequence of the epidemic. But there hasn't been a great deal, just a little bit of scapegoating. Now, this woman is called Karen Mullen. She's a highly sympathetic figure. In addition, she's an immensely successful virologist and has contributed a lot to what we've been talking about. The football is incidental. Let's put there for Neville. And she's written a book, which I strongly recommend to you, called Viruses, More Friends Than Enemies. How can that be after what we've just been through? Well, here's a couple. Where is this? West Dean? Is that somewhere? Seven Sisters, yeah. Burling Gap, right? Is that there somewhere? Anyway, this couple is walking down here, and little do they know, as they smell the sea breeze, this is diethyl sulfate. This comes from the breakdown of algae that are being destroyed by viruses. When you look at the cliffs, how did the cliffs get there? Anybody got any idea? Once again, algae. No, not the algae. Emiliana Huxley, which is a coccolith in an algae. It's killed by a big virus, like a Mimi virus, and this calcium carbonate that's on the outside falls to the seabed and mounts up hundreds of feet into the air. And so we have chalk cliffs because viruses kill these algae. These are the blooms that you see of algae. The only thing that they are very deleterious to the ecology, the only thing that clears them away are viruses. There's a typical Mimi virus, and that's a picture of an island on Rügen in the Baltic. All from viruses. Oh, and one more small thing. Oxygen comes from plants, 50%, comes from blue-green algae in the ocean, 50%. 10% of those blue-green algae only turn on their photosynthesis button when infected by virus. So that 1 in 10 breaths that you take of oxygen come from viruses. I want you to remember that. I got to tell you about retroviruses. It's just incredible. Now, all right, you see now, here's a virus coming into a cell. It drops off its RNA, turns into double-stranded DNA, and sticks it into the chromosome of the cell. Now, if that happens to be a germ cell, you know, sperm, ovum, then it will be transmitted to the child that's formed, and so on, generation after generation after generation after generation. DNA will pass from a virus into your chromosome, and then all later offspring. How often do you think this happens? Can this happen very often? This is like when Sally met Harry, isn't it? 95,000. There's DNA from 95,000 viruses in your chromosomes that you didn't know about, which is 8% of your DNA. Now, the DNA that codes for the protein that makes up your entire body is only 2%. So it's 4 times as much viral DNA than the DNA that codes for all the proteins that make up your body. So this is an incredible number. And a further 37%. So you are 45% virus. Did you like the way it came up? Did you like that? I think that was good. I have more effects for you. Yeah, you are 45% virus. 45%, nearly half of your genome is made up from retroviral DNA. What is the significance of this? Well, it's like an accelerated evolution. If evolution, something changes, there's a random change in a molecule, and most of the time it's bad, but occasionally it's good. What you're doing is sticking in huge amounts of DNA, which could be bad and could kill the zygote and could kill the sperm and the ovum and could kill the person, or it may do some good. And there is one example, and that is a protein called syncytin, without which the placenta could not have evolved. So if it hadn't have been for this DNA from a virus, you would still be laying eggs. This is a picture, Keith Haring, during the AIDS epidemic, he painted these pictures all over the walls of New York. Now I'm going to talk about sex. This is the climax of my presentation. No, I didn't mean that. Look. This guy is called John Maynard Smith. I'm talking purely from a biological angle. You do understand that, don't you? John Maynard Smith was Dean of Sussex University, but before that he was an immensely profound biological thinker. And the thing he thought about was sex. He couldn't understand why sexual reproduction was so prevalent in the world. This is a E. coli bacteria multiplying by binary fission. Isn't that easy? It just multiplies, divides the chromosome, and you have 2 identical daughter cells. What could be easier than that? Why do we have to have sexual reproduction? This is the cost of sexual reproduction. Number 1, half of the offspring can't even have kids. Why do you need 50% males? Wouldn't 2% males be satisfactory? Apparently not. You have to have 50% males. If you have chicken sexers who work for chicken farmers, they pay them money to tell the difference between male and female at birth. And if they're male, they kill them. Or they use the word cull. And they cull them. And this has attracted a lot of bad attention, but the principle is still there. The chicken sexes are paid to determine male chicks and to kill them because they're no use. They can't have eggs. You need a few roosters, but you don't need 50%. The same with dairy farmers. If you talk to a dairy farmer, they pray for a heifer. A heifer can give you milk. A heifer can give you more offspring. What's the bull got? Nothing. They raise them for food. That's the only reason. And it's a cost to a dairy farmer to have too many male offspring, right? So if you multiply by sexual reproduction, you only have 1 kid at a time. If you multiply by binary fission, it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. With sexual reproduction, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's inefficient. That's the second problem with sexual reproduction. Then you have to evolve the anatomical apparatus necessary for sexual reproduction. All of these other things. Look, dating is a problem, right? Dating is a particular problem. No, this is quite serious because you get males fighting each other and courtship, brouhaha. You wouldn't have any of that if you just divided by binary fission. Sexually transmitted diseases. It's interesting to note that the commonest cancers in females are cancer of the breast, the ovary, and the uterus. Now, this might be related to the evolution of these organs. And if we only replicated by binary fission, None of all this stuff would be necessary. Why is it then that 99% of animals multiply by sexual reproduction? And this was John Maynard Smith's big preoccupation. And has anybody got any ideas why this should be so? Why don't, you know, Maggie, why don't you just divide? Then there would be two of you. I mean, you wouldn't have to date, you wouldn't have to go out, anything. The answer is as follows. Now, this is the first fleet landing in Australia. The answer is in Australia. They took with them 6 pairs of rabbits when they went to Australia. By 1950, there were 2 billion rabbits in Australia. They were destroying the crop. There were no rabbits there before. They were breeding like rabbits. And there were billions of them. So somebody had the wonderfully clever idea of giving them myxomatosis. You give them a virus which kills 99.9% of rabbits. 0.1% is a large number. It's about 100,000. And considering this tribe had grown from 6 pairs of rabbits that went there in the first place, 100,000 rabbits out of this billion survived. And by 1970, there were as many rabbits in Australia as there were before they took myxomatosis there. And what's more, they're resistant to myxomatosis. It means nothing to them. It doesn't have any effect on them. So this is why we have sexual reproduction, because of plagues. With sexual reproduction, you mix your genes. All of us in this room, it's like fingerprints. Your genes are all different at a tremendous rate. Polymorphism, it's called. There's so much difference between each individual's genes, so that if a plague comes along, it's going to kill maybe a lot of you, but it's not going to ruin the species. Some people will be resistant. 100% of people don't die from AIDS, do they? No, it's more like 96%. Well, that's a lot, but those 4% are immune, and their children are immune. So sexual reproduction, in spite of all the difficulties associated with it, enables us to mix our genes so that when plagues come along, a small number survive. Now, in binary fission, they all have the same lottery ticket. You know, I'm going into the world with this one lottery ticket. With sexual reproduction, you have 100 different ones, so you have a better chance of survival. Some members of the species. Mother Nature is not very maternal in this respect. All Mother Nature cares about is the species. Doesn't care if a few 100,000 die, so long as the species survives. And it's plagues that are the evolutionary pressure that has led to the evolution of sexual reproduction. So to put it another way, if it were not for viruses, you wouldn't exist. And this is the message of my presentation today. If it wasn't for viruses, we wouldn't be here. It's the Red Queen talking to Alice. The Red Queen said that you have to run to stay in the same place. You have to keep running just to stay in the same place. And that is what evolution is all about. You're adapting, the pathogen's adapting, you're adapting to the adaptation, and so on. This is the Red Queen. Now, I wanted to close, really. I think that the idea that sexual reproduction and viral infections are the reason that we're here is a pretty telling conclusion. So now I want to say something a little more modest, a little more peaceful, and a little more quiet. What I've noticed from the beginning of this pandemic is that people have been making predictions, and they've nearly always been wrong. So I said early on, I'm not going to make any predictions about anything, but I've changed my mind. I am going to make predictions. Because in 1989, there was a global pandemic. It was called the Russian flu. It's been overshadowed by the Spanish flu. Not many people know about the Russian flu, but it spread all over the world. It spread from the Uzbekistan steppe all the way to St. Petersburg, and then by steamboat and train all over Europe, and then it made it to New York. It has some parallels, actually, with this present epidemic. The British Prime Minister of the time got the infection and survived. His name is Lord Salisbury. They treated it with quinine, which is an anti-malarial, which has been boosted by the President of the United States. It spread to New York, was devastated by the Russian flu. This is a picture of a coronavirus. This is Salisbury Plain. This is the Common Cold Unit. Do you remember the Common Cold Unit? It's called Harvard Hospital. And people would love to go there for vacation. They go there for 2 weeks. They meet people of their own age. They'd get 7 and 6pence spending money every day. Accommodation was free. People actually went there, and they would be infested with viruses. And 1 in 3 of them would get a common cold. You know, the common cold, the one thing that medical science doesn't know how to cure, right? They would get the common cold. Now, the work that was done there was really quite extraordinary. They identified at least 10 viruses that cause the common cold. But because it's the common cold, nobody was that interested. Had you cured cancer, had you predicted that in the future there was going to be a pandemic of coronaviruses, these viruses, OC43, all of these, cause the common cold and were coronaviruses and were discovered at that common cold unit. These are the other coronaviruses that cause disease in humans. But remember OC43 for a moment. Oh yes, this is the Russian flu again, which was trying to take. 1 million died. Lord Salisbury was infected. The grandson of Queen Victoria died. It's commoner in men. But they knew nothing of viruses back then. They thought it was caused by miasma. Men more than women, which is also true of the coronavirus. Now, Belgian scientists found this coronavirus, OC43, in cattle. And when they looked at the DNA and compared it to the one that causes the common cold in humans, they realized it originated in 1889, the year of the Russian flu. So they think that this virus was a coronavirus with the Russian flu. And it's really quite telling. The research was done in something like 205, and it's all written out there. They say, we believe that it was a coronavirus that caused the Russian flu, a global pandemic, in 1989, 1990. Long before this one came around. No one was interested in coronaviruses until SARS came along, SARS-2. So the Russian flu was caused by a coronavirus, OC43. So they said to themselves, look, this present virus, if it's going to behave like anything, it's going to behave like the virus that caused the Russian flu in 1889. So what happened with that virus? It came back 3 winters in a row. The second winter was pretty bad. The third winter was much lighter. And thereafter, it caused the common cold. So I'm not going to make predictions about the future. But if this is anything like the coronavirus that caused the Russian flu, that's what's going to happen with our coronavirus, SARS-2. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Not quite. I have one more thing to say. This is one of our nurses in a Rosie the Riveter posture. Yeah. And the nurses are the true heroes of this epidemic. I mean that from the bottom of my heart, and we ought to acknowledge that and respect it. I have never been so proud of a group of practitioners as I was of the nurses in my hospital through the pandemic. They turned up for work every day, they went to work, they were in and out of the rooms with desperately sick people. This was early in the course of the epidemic. They didn't know how vulnerable they were going to be. They realized that they were risking their lives. And yet they turned up and did it. And I'm extremely proud of them. And I want to say that out loud. God bless the nurses. You know, this where it's very nice to go out and applaud in the streets, but I think you should give them more money. Yeah. Right. If we have any questions, does anybody want to?
What's your view on when we may get a successful vaccine, irrespective of whether it's enough to cover everybody, but at least a vaccine to start with?
I don't know.
No.
No idea.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Thanks.
there are untold difficulties with vaccines that we don't think about, particularly side effects, particularly if it's like the Russian flu, then next year may be the last one where they have serious illness, and the one after that, it'll be just like the common cold, and you won't even need a vaccine. So you just don't know. I don't know. I don't know, full stop.
Do you have one?
Well, I get the flu shot every year. Does anybody else get the flu shot? Good, good. That's very excellent. I'm in favor of the flu shot. This vaccine, I don't know. You also hear people talking about herd immunity as if this was the answer. But herd immunity means that you're committing to death, a certain number of people. And we don't want to do that. We don't do that, do we? We don't say, okay, we'll just let a few people die and then we'll have herd immunity. It forces us to go through these irritating procedures of uncertain value, but we're doing it because we're a community and we're committed to do the best we can to prevent the virus from spreading to other people. You would think, would you not, that here is a virus that spread around the world in 4 months, that people would put aside petty political differences and come together, in hopes of overcoming the problem. Well, good luck with that. Particularly in the United States of America, where it's extraordinary to see them making, this is how people reacted to medieval plagues. Learning about viruses hasn't really made any difference to people's behavior when confronted with pandemics. Same as ever was.
Can I ask a question about the oceans?
Yes.
With us pouring so much rubbish into the ocean,
Yes.
is there any chance that the viruses will adapt and either cope with it or make the oceans worse than they already are?
The viruses can do anything. There are viruses that degrade plastic already. Extraordinary. And maybe the answer to the plastic in the ocean is viruses. I don't know. This is beyond my pay grade, as they say. But the world's in a terrible state of chaos, isn't it? Chassis. And it's very difficult to predict the future. And I don't think we can do it.
Spanish flu killed young men.
It did.
This virus is killing old people who are overweight or have some other disease. Do they know what the
reason for that
age was for the Russian flu? Is there any evidence that infected
No.
one group more than another?
Not that I know of. I believe that it infected mostly males, more males than females, which is typical of coronavirus. But I don't know anything about how fat they were. I'm going to look into that. It's a very good question. But this is what makes the coronavirus pandemic that we're living through unique. Spread around the world in 4 months, outlined in 2020. It's the first internet plague. When anything happens anywhere else in the world, it's immediately available to everybody else in the world. This is both a good thing and a bad thing because you get a lot of paranoid conspiracy theories gaining ground and amplified by the internet. There are people out there who think that it was made by the Chinese on purpose to kill us. It has unique clinical features. That is, it rarely affects the young. This is unique in infectious diseases because young children, their immunity is it's growing, it's being developed by infections that children get in early childhood. And old people, people over 65, not us, people it's waning, your immunity is waning. So young people don't get this infection, funnily enough, by which I mean children. That's unique to me. I've never heard of that before. And then we have this matter of prolonged convalescence. Prolonged convalescence is not new. You will remember that in people who had glandular fever, which is what it's called mono in America, mono, and glandular fever in this country. People characteristically suffer from prolonged convalescence afterwards. They feel knackered and exhausted and can't focus or concentrate for maybe a year. One of the interesting things about COVID is at the time of onset, you lose smell, sense of smell, and taste, known as anosmia in the medical profession. So you develop anosmia, and that anosmia can persist into the convalescent period. You can also develop tinnitus, ringing in the ears, as a consequence of this infection, and it can persist for a very long time. These are unique features of this particular infection.
John,
Yeah.
how did you learn to stop worrying?
I worked through it, and I didn't catch it. That's basically it. The incidence was very low in healthcare workers. There was one nurse who got it, was quite sick, but she didn't need to go to the intensive therapy unit. There was a doctor who was a nephrologist. She went home one day, and her husband gave her a glass of wine, and she couldn't smell it. So she diagnosed herself. And she was sick for 3 weeks with fever. And there was a local GP who was on a ventilator. And then you know that with extreme cases of this infection, they would put you on a heart-lung machine to pump blood round and oxygenate it. As it comes out of your body, you oxygenate it and put it back in. This is very desperate, and you can only live for 10 days on a heart-lung machine. But one of our patients was on a heart-lung machine for 21 days and survived and walked out. So there are the miracles, But there are also patients who came in very sick and rapidly went downhill and died in spite of anything that you could do for them. And they weren't all old either, by any means. We had a 46-year-old, we had a 22-year-old who just went downhill and died. So when people tell you this is nothing, this is not nothing. This pandemic is not nothing. The mortality of smallpox is 30%. The mortality of coronavirus is 0.5%. But 0.5% is a lot of people. It's a lot of people. So really, I haven't stopped worrying about it, actually. It's just a glib title.
Human behaviour.
Yes.
We've been talking about viruses, but also you're talking about human behaviour.
Yes, you are.
All the time. If you're going to say one thing that we should think about in terms of human, is it about consistency of activity or variety of approaches? It is a way of distilling how, as humans, we should take some responsibility for this.
You know, I would have thought that knowing what we know about viruses and how they're transmitted, that it wouldn't be too difficult for us to come together and figure out the best way to deal with it. The surprising thing is that we do know a lot about viruses and how they're transmitted. We do know a lot about pathophysiology of the infection. We've learned an enormous amount, or the medical profession has, about this infection. It's just that I don't know what to say. You know, people are crazy. People voted for Trump. What are you going to do? You know, you're going to run a sociopath in the White House. How did that happen? And he attacks Anthony Fauci, who is spent a lifetime studying epidemiology and infectious diseases, and is head of the most prestigious organization dealing with such matters, epidemiology and infectious disease, in the world. And the president calls him an idiot. I mean, how do you account for this? So if I could change people's attitudes, or the attitudes of losers, I mean, slip of the tongue, leaders. It does blow your mind, doesn't it, to see that the politicization and the conflict that's come over this, which is reminiscent of medieval plagues. The Black Death, for instance, led to pogroms in Europe because the Jews were held responsible for the plague. They'd been poisoning the well water, apparently, and many thousands were killed or exiled. So people don't respond very well or sanely to plagues.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes, indeed.
What do you think is the cause for the
This has been known for thousands of years. It's called convalescence. Everybody has little experience of convalescence. You know that if you have the flu, you're sick for 7 days, and then the flu's gone, but you're not yourself. You're easily tired, you're exhausted for 2, 3 days, 4 days before you go back to work. That's convalescence. People are prone to prolonged convalescence after all kinds of infections, including influenza. We mentioned glandular fever earlier, but there are many infections that are associated with a prolonged convalescence. They nearly all recover by themselves after, at the worst, 6 months, sometimes even longer, but they never last longer than a year. And all you have to do is survive it. You have to take one day at a time. You have to look after yourself. You mustn't make ambitious plans. You should take vitamins, and you should live healthily, and that is the best way to deal with prolonged convalescence. But it's a real problem whose entity has been known forever, but nobody understands the physiology that underlies it. You think about a village where a hurricane has been through the village, and the hurricane is gone, but the village is destroyed. It takes time to build up the village again. That's a sort of a metaphor. I would be happier if we actually knew what the physiology was, but we don't. I would have predicted, here's where your predictions go wrong, that the next pandemic, because there will be another pandemic, and would come from the rainforest, and the name of the virus would be Revenge of the Rainforest. Revenge of the Rainforest virus, because you go into the pandemics come out. This isn't new. It's happened 10 times, 15 times already. So I would have thought it would come from the rainforest, but I understand there are a lot of bats in caves hanging out in Wuhan, and these are the reservoir for the viruses. As I say, there's usually an intermediate host. When it was starting, everybody was saying it was the pangolin, but they've done studies now that show it wasn't the pangolin. But it's like bush meat. I was showing you the bush meat in the jungle of Africa. The wet meat market in China is exactly similar with all kinds of food. So the general thought is that there was an intermediate host, and it was meat in the intermediate host that spread to people who went to that market. Is that exactly what happened? I don't know. Consider HIV. It's pretty much established now that bushmeat hunters cut themselves while chopping up gorillas to eat. You know, and if you go to West Africa, to Cameroon, and to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is neither democratic nor a republic, but it is it is around the Congo, there's lots of retroviruses, like HIV virus, in people who do this kind of work. So that's how that one started. People transferred blood. Mosquitoes, that's another wonderful thing. But this one is breath, and it's extraordinarily contagious. It's incredibly contagious, isn't it? To think that this thing came from China to Shoreham-by-Sea. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. Any other questions?
If you were put in charge of the country or the world,
If I ruled the world, every day would be the first day of spring.
would you do the same sort of social distancing stuff the government has put into place, or would you throw that in the bucket and just everyone stays?
Well, look, I have thought about that. I don't know that these masks and our social distancing is necessarily doing very much. But I do feel that we ought to act together as a community. And whether it's doing a great deal or it's not doing a great deal, we should conform. We have, through this pandemic, not for the rest of your life, but just through this pandemic, I think it's important that we all act together as a community. And if there is definite proof, I think, that social distancing does reduce the incidence of the infection. Sweden, for instance, had a much bigger problem than Denmark. In Denmark, they used masks and social distancing. Sweden didn't. there have been these outbreaks at huge meetings in the United States. There was a guy called Herman Cain. Does anybody remember Herman Cain? He was a candidate for the Republican nomination for president at the same time that Donald Trump ran, and Trump won it. He was a black man, Herman Cain, and a millionaire. And he became friends with Trump after Trump got the nomination of the presidency. And he was seen going to all his meetings, ostentatiously not wearing a mask. And all his friends and ostentatiously refusing to have their freedom limited by being forced to wear masks in public. And we're proud Americans, we don't wear masks. The point of the mask is not necessarily to protect you so much as to protect somebody else. You might make the same argument about red traffic lights. I don't stop at red traffic lights. I'm a free man. I'm going to drive through the red light. No, we all make compromises in our lives for the sake of the community. Herman Cain died from coronavirus 2 weeks after a massive meeting that he attended without a mask. So is it 100% certain that the social distance and the masks work? No, but there is some tentative evidence that supports it. And you know, I think we should support it too, as irritating as it is, until we learn more. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a nice day. Now I can have a drink.